Hello, I'm Christopher Winn.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
A podcast about the life, the world and the legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith. Hal felt the sudden constriction of dread in his chest. He straightened in his chair and his voice was tight as he murmured, "Forgive me, my lord, but I arrived in London only this morning and I have heard no news." "You are fortunate, then. The news is not good," Childs grunted, and lifted a lump of beef, dripping blood, to his mouth. He chewed and swallowed, then took a gulp of the claret. 2 weeks ago, the company ship Yeoman of York tied up at the East India docks. She was 62 days out from Bombay with a cargo of cotton and cochineal, and dispatches from Gerald Ongier, the governor of the colony. Childs frowned and shook his head, reluctant to speak the next words. "We have lost 2 ships, the Minotaur and the Albion Spring." Hal rocked back in his chair as though he had taken a punch to the head. "Those 2 are the pride of the fleet," he exclaimed. It was almost impossible to believe. The East Indiamen, those stately, magnificent vessels, were the lords of the oceans, built not only for the carrying of cargo, but for the prestige of the great and prosperous company that owned them, and of the English crown under whose charter they sailed. Wrecked? Hal hazarded. Even the might of the company must be shaken by the magnitude of the loss. 1 such vessel sunk was a terrible blow. 2 ships lost was a disaster, perhaps worth £100,000 with the cargoes. "Where were they wrecked?" he demanded. "The Agulhas Bank? The coral reefs of the Mascarenes?" "They were not wrecked," said Childs ominously. "What then?" "Pirates," said Childs.
That was a reading from Wilbur Smith's Monsoon, and describes the meeting between our hero, Sir Hal Courtney, and Lord Childs, chairman of the governors of the English East India Company. And at this meeting, Hal is commissioned to sail off to the Indian Ocean and seek out the corsairs, or pirates, who are harassing company ships there. And it's the East India Company that is the subject of our podcast today.
And we're very fortunate to have with us an expert on the subject, Professor David Howarth, Emeritus Professor of Baroque Art at Edinburgh University, where he taught for 35 years, who's written a number of books, including Lord Arundel and His Circle, about the Arundel Collection, which was the first major collection of antiquities to have been formed in England, Images of Rule, which examines the relationship between art and political power during the time of the Tudors and Stuarts, The Invention of Spain, about cultural relations between Britain and Spain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the book that brings us together today, Adventurers, The Improbable Rise of the East India Company. So, Professor Howarth, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Professor, your speciality is art and art collections. So what inspired you to write a book about the East India Company?
Well, I've always been very interested in art as a historical document. You look at paintings, you look at buildings, you look at material culture, and you can read as much from them as you can perhaps from a document. And one of the major transmitters of culture, of course, is commerce. And I had a sort of epiphany. I had a moment of great excitement when I was in Italy as a young PhD student and working in the State Archives in Florence, that's to say Tuscany. And I came across a wonderfully exciting collection of mercantile correspondence, invoices, manifests, the stuff which is the sort of subsoil, the humus of the East India Company. It was 3 merchants trading out of Livorno, or Leghorn as it was called by the English at that time. And you could just imagine somebody scribbling a note on the quayside in almost illegible writing as the boat was waiting to get off. And this was overseen by the Tuscan state, who were in constant contact with their representative in London, who was a man called Amerigo Salvetti. And one of his things, then as now, was to try to encourage trade. And I, whilst working on these collections of letters, I was also reading his official correspondence, and I came across an absolutely marvelous piece of material culture, a sort of gem, which was a letter sent to Salvetti, who was then in London in, I think, 1628. And in the side of the letter, down the margin, were a whole series of little samples of Florentine Italian silk. And it looked to me as if that letter had not been opened, had not been exposed to light since Salvetti himself had brought it back as part of his diplomatic baggage. And the colours were stupendous, these wonderful vegetable dyes, sort of corals and dark greens and blues, aquamarines, in a perfect state of preservation. And I said to myself then, this is something I'd like to really work on. And many, many years later, I started truffling around the East India Library, which is now part of the British Library in the Euston Road. And it very rapidly became apparent to me that the same vividness, the immediacy, the depth, the in-depth capacity to study something so as to bring it to life and to really kind of be in touch with the physical remains of the early modern period was present in the East India Company archive, despite the fact that legend has it they spent 10 days after the company was closed down following the Indian Mutiny in 1858. There were sort of incredible bonfires, not of the vanities, but of the material culture of the East India Company in Company House courtyard. Nevertheless, as a rather alarming Russian woman who looked as if she'd perhaps last thrown the javelin at the Olympics, who was presiding behind the desk of the library, said to me, you know, there are 11 kilometers of papers. So the survival is astounding. And for me, I've spent my life working largely on deposits of archival deposits of the early modern period. The East India Company record is by far and away the most exciting and the most comprehensive, because all aspects of life are there.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of work, a tiny bit of work in the East India Archive when I was working on The Tiger's Prey, which is a book I did with Wilbur. And again, you pull out the logbooks, the factors kept in their factories in India, I think it was. And yeah, you're touching the pieces of paper and the ink that they actually wrote on out there, reading their words. It's absolutely extraordinary to sort of touch history like that.
Yes, it's like Catholics with their relics,
Yes, yes.
The finger bone of St. John or something,
Yes, an almost religious experience.
Yes.
Your book's called Adventurers, which is a splendid title for our podcast because we're all about adventure writing. But in fact, in this context, it means something slightly different or adjacent maybe to what we would normally think of as adventuring.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you say that, but these people took crazy risks. I mean, they were not pirates, but one of the things that fascinated me and still fascinates me is how and why these people were prepared to risk all in going to places like India and indeed much further afield, Japan, even Korea, when there were no inoculations, there were these terrible diseases. I know the story always is, and rightly, that it's, as it were, the West destroying indigenous cultures all over the world by importing their diseases. But the death rate was phenomenal. I mean, 1 in 3 people did not come back, and many of those who did suffered ill health. So it was an adventure, even if it wasn't quite, as it were, like Monsoon. It wasn't, I mean, indeed, the East India Company gave very clear instructions in its earliest days not to be an aggressive power, not to, as it were, start firing on other ships, even though the rivalry was intense and there was a great deal of aggression between the European nations like the Spanish and the Portuguese. The East India Company largely wanted to keep out of trouble. I mean, it's very, very important to realize that this was not an imperialistic venture. Still less was it an organized piracy.
Well, indeed, yes, the company may not have been an organised piracy, but I'm sure they had some problems with pirates. But in Wilbur's book, Monsoon, the hero Hal Courtney is commissioned by the company to sail to the Indian Ocean and chase down some pirates who've been causing havoc with the company ships. Now, in your opinion, could this have happened? I mean, is this a realistic scenario to be having trouble with pirates?
Yes, it is. It isn't in the sense that I think by the 18th century it was very difficult indeed to capture an East Indiaman because they were massively large and well armed. And actually, there are very, very few records of pirates. Indeed, I can't think of a single case of a pirate jumping a East Indiaman in my period, in the early modern period. I mean, there was massive intrusion of piracy, ironically, less in the Indian Ocean than in the English Channel and the Bristol Channel. I mean, the maidens of Ilfracombe were frequently swept away and incarcerated in Tunis or something like that. And there was the companies we're talking about, not only the East India Company, but the Levant and all the rest of them were required by Charles I to ante up and provide some money to pay for fleets to try and keep the seas clear of Algerine, as they were called, pirates. But I think the East India men, even from the early days, were pretty powerful, pretty stocky, well-built ships, well-armed for defence. But it was defence that they were interested in. And obviously that was the important thing because of the value of the cargoes. So I think there's a bit of license there. I mean, it makes a very gripping tale, and I enjoyed Monsoon enormously. I couldn't put it down, but I'm not sure how accurate a picture. I mean, it's well worth actually looking into how many ships were captured.
I mean, I suppose in the extract we read, that is the shock factor, isn't it? That he can't believe that in East India Company ship, let alone two, have been captured. So in that respect, I guess Wilbur's working with the fact that it is pretty unbelievable.
Yes, I think possibly. I mean, it was very, very hazardous indeed taking these long voyages. I mean, you talked in that extract about the pride of the fleet and the power of the East India Company. There was very little pride and almost no power to begin with. But the tragedy was that they invested in one massive ship, which was called the Trade's Increase, which was actually Sir Henry Middleton's flagship. And that cost an unbelievable amount of money. And it never made it home. It got wrecked on the last leg of its maiden voyage, and then was beached somewhere in the East Indies and caught fire, and that was the end of it. And I think it killed Middleton because he died of shame and grief. And that ill-starred voyage that he presided over when he was required to walk across the Yemen in chains. So it was very, very dangerous. I mean, it depends how you define piracy. Certainly, in the Yemen with Middleton, it was a sort of land-based piracy because they were trying to basically extract the contents of the ships with with threats of, terrible mortal death and things like that.
I mean, walking across the Yemen in chains, again, is something right out of one of Wilbur's books. I just want to get the timeline a bit here, actually, because Monsoon starts, I think, around 1690, but your book actually mainly focuses on the earlier period,
yes,
sort of the very formative embryonic years of the East India Company, which is fascinating to me because we're familiar with it in its pomp in the sort of later 18th and 19th centuries. And seeing it being present at the birth was a very different view. But one of the things that I was really interested in was that actually for the first few chapters of your book, sort of ships and spices and trade feature very little because you're actually setting the scene in the culture of late Tudor England, and the way that it's not just an East India Company, it's the English East India Company, and it's coming out of a very specific moment in English history, and maybe that's contributing to its success. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, I see the book as having a taproot, not fibrous roots. I mean, it goes very, very deep down, I think. And this, in part, I've emphasized this, I believe it, and I hope that my argument is persuasive. But I do it in part because I set my face against the idea that is current at the moment, namely that from the beginning to the end, the East India Company was a sort of gigantic conspiracy to, defraud other cultures, to subjugate the native, and to dominate the East by the West. And my view is that the East India Company had a very slow gestation, about 100 years. I mean, the parameters, the chronology is 1550 to 1650, which is the bookends during which it appears on the scene, and by 1650 we can take it that at last it's there to stay. But conspiracies, be they imperialist or otherwise, tend to take more than 100 years, less than 100 years, I should say, to mature. And my argument is that the East India Company comes out, is central to English culture, and that a whole lot of different factors came to contribute to what was absolutely necessary, the fundamental catalyst, which was that there was a strong, confident identity about what it meant to be English. And whether that's to do with the Anglican settlement or the achievement of Shakespeare or the other companies that predate the East India Company and set a kind of template for them. Although the East India Company was obviously the most successful of them all, and indeed it could be argued has been or was the most celebrated and powerful global in history. It didn't start like that. And it benefited from the mistakes, as it benefited also from the support of precursors. So it's really important to explore all these ramifications, this sort of humus out of which the plant grows, as it were.
You introduce us to a wonderful cast of characters who were involved in creating the conditions which made the forming of the East India Company possible. You've got Thomas Cromwell, of course, who was perhaps the first bureaucrat. Then there's Thomas Munn, a rather fascinating character, who was perhaps the first real advocate for free trade.
Yes.
And the first governor of the company, of course, Thomas Smythe.
Yes.
But I think my own favourite was Richard Hakluyt,
Oh, yes.
who I came across when I was researching for my church book in Wetheringset in Suffolk, where he was the rector for 20 years.
Yeah.
And he's known as the father of travel writers.
Yes.
And as a travel writer myself, that sort of makes him my patron saint. So can you tell us a bit more about him?
Yes, he was educated at Oxford and was picked up, as it were, or identified by Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Elizabeth's spymaster, amongst other things. He was sort of head of MI5, and given support and encouragement. And he then went into the church, as you well know, and through, I think, in part, his writing and his lobby. He was a very, very effective lobbyist. I mean, he'd have done really well in Parliament today. He had the ear of the Queen, although Elizabeth sometimes found him rather tiresome. But as a result of that, I think he was promoted to a very, very comfortable position in the church, not on the merits of his theology. I mean, he was no John Donne or Lancelot Andrews, but he had a position at Westminster Abbey, which of course was strategically placed for access to the seats of power, where he could lobby on behalf of the English maritime power. And there's no question about it, but his writings were extremely effective in supporting the Navy, the need for a powerful English maritime presence in the Channel and beyond. And he's a very good writer and a wonderful historian and indefatigable. I mean, the amount he wrote is almost Dickensian in its breadth and the energy and everything. He was obviously a person of extraordinary productivity and energy and versatility. And he then had this amanuensis, this his sort of scribe and I think probably research assistant called Percus, who carried on, inherited the sort of the works and published more of Hakluyt's material in various publications that were published after the death of Hakluyt, which I think was in 1617. But it made, I think, the English the sort of foremost travel writers of the early modern world. And it wasn't just English stories. I mean, what Samuel Percus did was to gather together all sorts of different travel accounts, not merely Christian, but Muslim as well. And they had a global ambition, which was astonishing, which, as it were, complements and corresponds to the global ambition that the actual mariners had. And these books were taken very seriously. I mean, Sir Thomas Smythe, or Smith, I like to call him Smythe because of the Y, but he ordered that copies of Hakluyt and Percus should be on board the ships. Each ship had a modest library, and alongside the Bible was Hakluyt. And so there's a real sense in which Hakluyt's writings, albeit they were academic in one sense, had a very powerful impact on policy. So he was very, very important, unquestionably. And there's a thing called the Hakluyt Society, which is, as you know, publishes travel accounts from all over the world and has been going for 150 years, named after him in his honor. But he was very careful to avoid travel himself. The only thing he ever did was to cross the channel on the cross-channel ferry. He was offered some position in America and he dodged that and sent somebody out instead of himself. But he was also a spy, which I think ties in with the Walsingham connection. He was ostensibly chaplain at the English embassy in Paris, but was all the time spying for the English government. So you can see what an interesting chap he was.
Yeah, I mean, and what I find fascinating, one of the recurring themes on this podcast is how many people that we speak to have been inspired by travel writing, either very often in Wilbur's descriptions of Africa or other things they've read at a kind of formative stage. And that's inspired them to go off and have adventures in far-flung parts of the world. And I'm fascinated that even 400 years ago, the written word was having the same effect as sort of seizing people's imaginations and propelling them off all over the world. You talked about espionage. And of course, there's another aspect to the way the East India Company gets going, I think, which is sort of the aids to navigation, because, of course, they're not the first people or the first seafarers to get into the Indian Ocean and the East Indies.
No, indeed not.
They're actually starting with a sort of 100-year disadvantage. So can you sort of set the scene for us of the sort of the competition, as it were, the international competition?
Well, one of the most romantic aspects of what you might call the expansion of Europe, as it used to be called when I was at Cambridge and did a paper called The Expansion of Europe, was the fact that the Portuguese were first in the field. I mean, Portugal, it may be England's oldest ally, which it is. The oldest treaty with a European power is one with Portugal. But it was a very minor player in Europe. I mean, it was a land of cork and sardines, basically. But off they went because clearly having the Atlantic was a sort of lure. It wasn't just the tide that came in, it also pulled them out. And they were off. I mean, the Portuguese really started in the 1415, the date of Agincourt. So, I mean, that's when they first made their tentative landings in North Africa. I mean, whether you can call that oceanic travel, I rather doubt. But I mean, the gesture was there, the intention was there. So, that's actually nearly 200 years before the East India Company was founded in 1600. But, and they did phenomenally well, but there were two problems with the Portuguese. They were too successful too quickly. And they made the fatal decision to try and proselytize. Instead of, basing themselves on trade, Cochineal went hand in hand with Christianity. And it was a disastrous combination because they overextended themselves. There was the very famous Duke of Albuquerque, who swept across the Indian Ocean and into Asia, and within 5 years or so had established forts, trading stations dotted everywhere. But they were a tiny country. The Portuguese population, the period we're talking about, the whole country was the size of what Glasgow is now. And they recruited as well as they could, but they were overextended. And certainly the most famous commentator, English commentator of the scene on the ground in India, had no doubt that the fatal thing about the Portuguese Empire, and it had become apparent by 1600 that it was seriously weakened and had, was past its zenith, was building forts, trying to conquer, and I think above all, wasting money, resources on conversion. And the East India Company had, and this is one of the ways in which the East India Company in its first phase is so completely different to what it became in the early 19th century with the Clapham sect and the evangelicals and the utilitarians. The East India Company had absolutely no interest, as far as I can see, in converting the native, if I may be allowed to use an offensive phrase. They were there to trade, and they wanted to keep, on the whole, under the radar. So there was a fundamental cultural difference between the Portuguese approach, the interface between, let's say, India and the Portuguese, and the East India Company and India.
And in fact, one of the telling details in your book that I really loved, this is actually the Spanish, I think, rather than the Portuguese, or maybe both. But the names of the ships, you make a very sort of telling point about comparing the names of the Iberian ships that are going out versus the names of the East India Company ships, the English ships.
Yes, no, that's true. I mean, that exactly makes the point that, their attention was divided. What were they really going to do? Was it a religious mission or was it a trade mission?
Yeah. And then the Portuguese ships have names like Madre de Deu or Santa Maria or whatever it might be. And the English ones, as you said, it's like trade's increase or freedom or there's one called Peppercorn, isn't there?
Yes, that's my favorite. I do try to write a little biography of Peppercorn. I mean, one of the sad things is it's utterly predictable, but we don't have any visual image of what an early East Indiaman looked like. I mean, there are, in the Pepys Library in Cambridge and Magdalen, there are some, I think, unique ship's architects' drawings of Tudor ships, but these would have been obviously presented, we know that, at board meetings, and then they'd have been used by the joiners, by whoever, and then obviously destroyed or fell into the Thames or whatever, which is sad because it would be wonderful to know what the Peppercorn looked like.
Yes. So, certainly from as someone who writes about that, it's definitely nice to know what they look like so you can describe them properly. Although artistic license is also a blessing.
Yes, yeah.
The people we haven't mentioned in the international scene yet are the Dutch, who feature very much in Wilbur's works, particularly in Birds of Prey, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company.
Yeah.
So tell us about the rivalry with the Dutch, because that is quite intense, I think.
Yes, I think that's, so to speak, the binding of the pages is I see as much as effort put into coming to terms with the Dutch and trying to defeat the Dutch commercially as any effort put in to Asia itself. I mean, the Dutch had been a threat. that had suddenly sprung up. I mean, the rise of the Dutch Republic was an astonishing achievement. I mean, I mentioned how small a country and relatively small population the Portuguese had. But I mean, you could travel across Holland if you were, if you really put your mind to it in a day from one side to the other. And yet they had, so to speak, seen off, or were in the process of seeing off the Spanish. They were intruding into the North Sea fishing fields, the whaling that came out of Hull and Scottish ports. They were everywhere. They were swarming all over the place. And Sir Thomas Smythe, who never really solved this problem, I mean, as you know, it wasn't going to be solved, in inverted commas, until the very end of the 17th century. But Sir Thomas Smith saw them as a very, very serious threat. And they were, because they had far more technical know-how. They were not better sailors than the British, than the English, but they certainly had much more technological advances in their shipyards. I mean, for example, they adapted their vessels, not only, as it were, to going up the Seine or the Scheldt or wherever it might be, the Rhine, the big rivers of Europe, but they even adapted to the different waters of the East Indies themselves. I mean, they knew the waters and the way the seas behaved, because I think to talk about the Indian Ocean is a very crude simplification. There are a number of Indian Oceans, and equally there are a number of seas beyond the Malay Peninsula. So they were, I think, far more sophisticated and skillful in terms of preparation. And the other thing is that they were part of the state. There's no question that the stadtholder, the Dutch government, saw the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, as an extension of the state. If the VOC fell, the Dutch state would fall. And they were, unlike the East India Company, they were mightily aggressive and did conduct campaigns to colonize and to capture. I mean, they employed ethnic cleansing. For example, in the Spice Islands, they were far more ruthless. It's not to say that there weren't atrocities committed by the East India Company, because there were, but not on the scale of the Dutch. And the crisis, the problem, the challenge that the Dutch represented came to a head in 1623 with the Amboina massacre, when the Dutch governor of this small spice island claimed that a group of about 10 English merchants were planning to capture Fort Victoria, which was the Dutch headquarters on the island. So these men were tortured, and most of them put to death. And it very, very nearly caused the First Dutch War, which of course actually didn't happen until the Cromwellian period in the 1650s. But it was always extremely difficult. And I think it hobbled the East India Company. Had it not been for the Dutch, I think it would have been more secure, more firmly founded, and vastly more profitable at a far earlier stage than actually was the case.
From your art history background, perhaps, you make, again, a lovely point about the difference between the crests and the mottos of the two East India Companies.
Yes.
And so the East India Company is Deus indicat Deo ducente nil nocet, with God leading, no harm arises, which you describe as a worthy Ivjejin sentiment. Whereas you describe the Dutch flag as two furious lions hold a shield upon which a third, with slavering tongue and penis erect, holds a blade in one paw and fasces in the other. Red in tooth and claw, these fearsome beasts support an imperative to imperialism, admitting of neither argument nor dissent. And the motto is Je maintiendrai, I will maintain. It's just a wonderful contrast in their attitudes.
Yes, it's the clenched fist. It's very much, whereas you could say it's the open palm, the clenched
Yeah.
fist. No, definitely. And I can't remember, but people knew that the Dutch were very dangerous people to cross. I mean, the great painter, Sir Peter Paul Rubens, who, apart from being the world's most successful painter at that stage, and indeed even more successful in the long term than perhaps Picasso, he was secretary to the Council of the Netherlands, and he writes a letter describing how the Dutch, if they captured a ship and they didn't like the people they captured, would tie them back to back and throw them overboard into the water. And he said that in this letter that they were going to seek reprisals and do the same. These were Spanish ships coming into the Spanish Netherlands. So they were greatly feared, and they were very, very successful. And they were also much tougher than the English. I mean, for example, one of the many mistakes Sir Thomas Smith made was to establish or try to establish trade with Japan on the basis that this would allow him and the company to gain an entrance through the servants, the tradesman's entrance to China. And the East India Company had a little trading station in a place called Hirado, which is on the very southeast tip. Anyway, when the shogun began to become extremely anti-Western as a result of the Jesuits converting so many Japanese, and they had developed their closed-door policy, the East India Company sort of said, well, too bad, it didn't work, we're off, and they pushed off. Whereas the Dutch were so keen to continue trading, they allowed themselves to be put on a mat of seaweed in the middle of Nagasaki Harbor, where they were fed sandwiches and prostitutes, and stayed there, until virtually the end of the company. They were prepared to put up with these terrible privations and the humiliation that the Japanese meted out because they were allowed a limited amount of trade, whereas the English thought, no, can't be doing with this, and left.
You said that unlike the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company wasn't very aggressive. But there is a wonderful, almost a real Wilbur-style villain in your book called Sir Thomas Dale, who apparently was sent out to more or less slaughter anyone who got in the way.
Yes.
Now, is that true?
Yes, no, that is true. But then what is also very important is that he had learnt to behave like that in America. He'd been a deputy governor of Virginia where he'd done this sort of thing. And so he tried to apply that and did indeed apply it to the East Indies. But there were a lot of people looking at him, subordinates out there, who utterly deplored what he was doing. And he died, and he was a disaster, really, partly because it went against the culture of the company. But we must remember, and it's a very interesting aspect of global history in the early modern period, that the approach to ethnic populations in North America was utterly different to what it was in Asia, because Indian civilization, Japanese civilization, was far older and more sophisticated than English, whereas obviously the Native Americans had their own cultural system, but it was completely incomprehensible and regarded as beneath contempt, largely, not entirely, because obviously we know about Captain Smith marrying an Indian princess. But I think that people like Dale were allowed to do that, and it was encouraged in Virginia, but it was not a success. I mean, it was Smith who sent him there, but then Smith was governor of the Virginia Company as well. So he thought unwisely that what worked in the West would work in the East, but he was quickly disabused.
And that's one of the extraordinary things, one of the many extraordinary things in the story, is how even what we think of as this very far back kind of Europe, still very much isolated. Actually, it's completely global. So Smith himself, as you say, is governor of the Virginia Company. He's governor of the East India Company, the Muscovy Company, and I think the Levant Company as well. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary how he managed it all. But sadly, we know almost nothing about him. I mean, his personal papers don't survive, which is a great shame. Um, he's one of the great mysteries of British commercial history. And I mean, there is a real sense in which it's a bit like you could say, some might say, that it doesn't matter who's in power, Conservative or Labour, because the system goes on. So Smith was actually made a number of disastrous errors of judgment, but there was enough profit margin if you could only limp home with a cargo, as it were, for it not to matter. But I mean, Japan was a big mistake, and there were other mistakes made as well. And he was always wringing his hands and saying, "This is going to end in disaster." And he had vociferous enemies because they manipulated the system. I mean, there was the Court of Committees, as it's called, which was basically the executive, the directors of the company. And then there was the General Court, which were the punters who chipped in 5 bob. And they were invited to the occasional meeting. But the directors, the Court of Committees, spent almost as much time thinking how they could avoid scrutiny as they did actually scrutinizing the inventories and the accounts. I mean, Sir Maurice Abbott, who succeeded Thomas Smythe, was completely shameless in doing everything he could to make sure that people didn't know what was going on.
Rather like the post office today.
Yes, well, yes.
So what was the relationship between the English East India Company and the state, or more particularly with the aristocracy?
Well, the critical thing was one of Smith's great successes was that he was not impressed by rank at all, and he kept the aristocracy at arm's length. He was determined that the company should be run by people who knew what they were doing. And it's a binary distinction, but I think it's quite valuable. I mean, what the aristocracy did do is they tended to go off to America and help themselves to large plantations. People like Lord Baltimore, for example, who was Secretary of State in the early 1620s. Baltimore in America is named after him. So the pursuit of glory and imperialism was something that the aristocracy were interested in, but they were not allowed within the winner's enclosure in the sense of the trade decisions. And there are examples of Smith basically telling aristocrats who were trying to get a job for the boys or their boy or whatever, look, this decision has to be made purely by us on merit and not on who you knew. And that was hugely important. I think that was one of the critical things that allowed the company to get through its very difficult early years. As for the crime, again, Smith was very, very good with dealing with James I because Smith clearly had great personal courage, and I think insofar as you can be director of so many companies, integrity. And he stood up to James. James was impossible because you never quite knew what his line was. You could never trust him. I mean, for example, James very much wanted peace with the Dutch and was not really prepared to support the company in being vigorous in opposing the Dutch because James fatally mixed insofar as he had an understanding of commerce and any perception that money mattered. He fatally mixed economic decisions with political decisions. His line in Europe was that the Dutch could be allies, but in fact, in terms of commerce, they were the enemy. And Smith found this very difficult. And then also, we talked about piracy. James I was a pirate. He would descend upon the company, demanding forced loans. The most egregious example of that is when, once the company had established itself in Persia, which it did partly to subsidize the meager returns from India, the Shah of Persia, Abbas I, bullied the company representatives in Isfahan to support him in the capture of Hormuz from the Portuguese. Now, when this got back to the UK, or to Europe, I should say, there was an enormous row. The Spanish, who by then had annexed Portugal, so between 1580 and 1640, Portugal was part of the Spanish crown. Those Spanish made a huge row about it. And on the one hand, James basically said, there's not much I can do about it. But then he turned around and he imposed a massive fine on the East India Company for doing this without his permission. And not only for himself, but for his boyfriend, the Duke of Buckingham. So they both had to be paid off with large bribes. So he was not really supportive. And then Charles I was the same, really. When Charles I found that the East India Company was not going to disgorge the money that he thought they should give him, he tried to set up a rival organization called the Corten Association, which was a sort of piratical outfit. But for various reasons, it didn't work. But in the mid-1630s, it looked as if it might be a real threat for the future of the company. So the East India Company could never look for consistency or understanding from the Crown, and it was always an extremely contested and difficult relationship, although all parties agreed, to use the famous phrase, that the East India Company had rapidly become a piece of state. So whilst it didn't have the absolutely central position in English society that the VOC had in Dutch, nevertheless, there came a point quite rapidly where it was seen that it couldn't be allowed to fail.
Yeah, one of the things that I found fascinating, because reading the story and in fact talking about it today, it sounds like a tale of disaster after disaster. They fail in Japan, India disappoints, ships sink. Yeah, you've got the poor Dutch eking out a living on this tiny seaweed raft. The kings are plundering them for fines and taxes. And yet, presumably, money is being made. So can you give us a sense of sort of the scale of the money that is being made, despite all these disasters?
Yes. You could make 1,000% profit on one bag of spice if you got it home and it hadn't been eaten by rats or soaked in the process. That was the thing. The profit margins were huge. Very great deal of money was made. And also England was, despite the problems of the Crown, the financial difficulties of the Crown, England was a very, very prosperous place. Contemporary diplomats, there's a man called John Chamberlain who, his incredibly important and valuable letters, which he wrote to his friend Sir Dudley Carleton, who was the ambassador in The Hague, tell us about the vast amounts of money that people, when a new voyage, as they called it, was announced and subscribers were invited, people would sort of, it was rather like buying the latest iPhone. People would be, twice round Old St. Paul's, queuing up to put in their groat into an investment for the next voyage. So the money made was enormous. But it's very important to realize that two things allowed for the prosperity and success of the company. One was the fact that a very large proportion of what came into London, and London was essentially what the East India Company was all about. It was like these days, London was what mattered. A great deal of that went out to Europe. It was re-exported. And indeed, not just to Europe, it would actually even find itself back not back, but in the Middle East. that was one thing. And the other was what's called coastal trading, whereby the East India Company would be a carrier, a haulage firm, if you like, taking things around the subcontinent from, let's say, Surat in Gujarat was the basis, was the most important single factory of the East India Company. But things would come out from London and then they would be deposited in various places right round the Malay Peninsula and so on, and then back again. And there would be trading between one port, on the the east coast of India, say, and the Malay Peninsula. So that was very important. And what attracted people was the fact that there could be very little supervision. I mean, there was a ban on so-called private trading, but how could you actually do that in practice? So people made enormous fortunes by defrauding the company, as they always, they did. When you look at Zoffany and all those people in their silk flowered waistcoats, they had made a nice little packet on the side without any supervision. So, some of the most successful merchants were drawn in to invest, and they might have brothers and cousins and so on, familial networks that operated between London and various factories in the East. But I mean, I came across a receipt of a woman called Mildred Archer, whoever she may have been, and she I think she put down 12 bob as an investment, and it's an illustration in the book. And it's a myth to think that the investors, it was a very, very broad-based pyramid, that the investors were merely, the aristocracy or the fabulously wealthy, livery company merchants. There were many, many ordinary punters who put in a small amount of money. So to that extent, that's one of the reasons it had such a broad social impact.
This is a public perception that the company merchants were all horribly rich and vastly cruel and debauched and swilling claret.
Yes.
I think Wilbur describes Lord Childs as overflowing from his chair,
Yes.
which conjures up a wonderful picture. But do you think it's entirely fair?
No, I don't think it's fair at all. I mean, one of the things, again, this is an antidote to the current orthodoxy that, unless I'm being crude and have simplified it, but there is a view that somehow Europeans despised India. They didn't. I mean, there was many of them were quite humble, when they were out there, and they took an interest in the culture of India. They were very, very sort of torn. They had a very ambivalent views, and I think a lot of them led respectable lives. And certainly the directors back home, the Court of Committees, they were very, very hard-working people. Many of them very godly. I haven't come across a sort of Childs-like case in my study. They were not nabobs, as they later became, and like Smith, often the East India Company was just one of many interests that they enjoyed. I mean, they might be involved in other companies altogether. So swilling claret, wearing sort of silk dressing gowns with your feet up on a stool because you've got gout because you've indulged for so many years, whilst pinching the bottom of a maid standing next to you, is not the puritanical image I have of how these hardworking men made their fortune. What I do think is fascinating, and I've not been able to get to the bottom of this, is who were these sort of people? Who were the people who directed the factories in Surat, or what became Bombay, or in Hirado in Japan? What sort of men were they? The man who ran the factory in Hirado had been a wool merchant. He was a member of the Drapers Company, and I think joined the East India Company because he had Spanish. I mean, many of these merchants were brilliant linguists. And he went out to Japan and traded there. But exactly what his background was, I don't know. And then there was another man called Aldworth, Thomas Aldworth, who was been mayor of Bristol. Now, why does a mayor of Bristol suddenly give that up and reinvent himself as the director of a factory in India? Because he had already done really well. I mean, Bristol was England's second port. And he'd made enough money to build himself a nice house in the high street and just, enjoy his retirement, but not a bit of it. Out he goes to India. And he, as it were, holds the whole thing together at one point, when lots of people were saying this isn't working, we just give it up. So why they did it, what their priorities were, what their values were, it's very difficult to say, because we've got the most important single document, certainly as regards India, is the journal of Sir Thomas Roe, but we don't have there aren't private journals of these other men who supported Roe. And we know all about Roe's attitude to India. And he is a prime example of being completely ambivalent. On the one hand, I think he's very defensive, and that's why, but quite often he expresses contempt for what he sees as the indulgence of the Jahangir, the emperor. And then on the next page, he's utterly astounded by the beauty and the sophistication of the place. So to get the measure of what they really thought, who they were, why they did it, is elusive, to put it mildly, but fascinating.
And I think probably one of the things that motivates people like me and of course Wilbur in trying to conjure up those people who were there and what it must have been like. And I guess in a more academic way for you too, it's amazing to have started with those cloth samples 35 years ago, whenever it was, in a Florentine archive, and to sort of build out this whole world that surrounded it in your book.
Yes, we all think of the East India Company as hugely successful, but do you think that its greatest success was the fact that it survived at all after that inauspicious start?
Certainly, yes, absolutely. It could so easily have gone down. And I think it was actually Cromwell who saved it.
Cromwell, gosh.
Because he decided to back it by renewing its charter. It had been severely battered by the Civil War and was a sort of, its sails were all torn and ragged, the paint had come off, it was sort of half waterlogged. But because he wanted to take on the Dutch and defeat them for commercial reasons, he had to renew the charter in 1657. But to get back to a point I made earlier, as soon as it was renewed, there was a massive cornucopia of wealth descended on the East India Company, because I think the Civil War and the uncertainty as to whether the government was going to back it had inhibited people. But once Cromwell said, right, we're backing this, money showered in, which fundamentally, I think England was a prosperous nation. And there were a lot of people, a bit like, privatization in the 80s. There were a lot of people with money who decided that British Airways was worth investing in. And it was the same then. I think that people wanted it to work. And ultimately, because of the enormous amount of profit that could accrue if only a voyage could limp home, that was a cushion that prevented disaster, really. One final thing for me is it's rather sad to get back to the sort of parallel that runs through the book, the Dutch, the VOC versus the EIC. Just as there are no drawings of ships, no architect's plans, so we have very, very little material survival. With the museum in Greenwich has almost nothing on the East India Company, whereas the Rijksmuseum and the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam is full of a huge amount of material that acts as part of the historical story, the historical record. And that, again, I think is because of the importance of the VOC to the formation and survival of the Dutch state, whereas the English state, despite the Civil War, was never fundamentally in doubt.
Yeah. Although I think the chairs from the boardroom, are they still in the British Library, I think?
Chairs, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
I always get very excited when I see
yes. Yeah, but I mean, there are no pictures of what the fort looked like, the factory looked like in Surat. But I mean, there's so many parallels, like, you know, the importance of Hormuz at the time as it is now, as it was then, and the Yemen, pirates coming out of the Yemen and causing problems in the Red Sea. I mean, nothing changes in history, does it really?
Yeah. And I think certainly from your book, as you say, the geopolitics and the economics of it, that becomes incredibly clear. I say on a sort of global scale that I think with our modern mindset, we find hard to credit just how global it was 400 years ago. And I think in Wilbur's writing, is that, you know, human nature also doesn't change very much, and there will always be heroes and villains and people setting out to make their fortunes and to have adventures.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. This has been utterly compelling and fascinating, and makes me want to learn more and more about the East India Company. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Howarth, and being such an informative and entertaining guest.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure for me to talk about it. Thank you for asking me.
Now, Professor Howarth's book, Adventurers The Improbable Rise of the East India Company, is available on Amazon or at all good bookshops, and it's a mighty good read. So if you're interested in the origins of perhaps the world's most successful ever company, do go out and get it. And in the meantime, that's it from this episode of That Wilbur Smith Show. Do join us again next time. And it's goodbye from me, Christopher Winn.
And goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Winn. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.